I'd like to introduce an alternative state machine for Project 2's movie watcher calculations. In Dr. P's tutorial video, he introduces one with 4 states, and I believe 3 states. Well, it's certainly sufficient, and I expect it's easier to implement and easier to reason about, and easier to get right the first time. So, what are these 3 states? Well, it depends on what we have. So let's, for now, consider only attacks. So an attack involves a Jedi deployment arriving on the planet, and a stronger Sith deployment later arriving on the planet. We need to know whether or not there is a Jedi deployment and whether or not an attack has happened. And since there can be no attack without a Jedi deployment, that leaves us 3 states. Alright, so no Jedi deployment and no attack yet. I will name that state 0. Oh, that's not a good 0. I'll name that state 0. And that's our initial state. State 1 is there have been Jedi deployments that have landed on the planet, but there have not been any attacks yet. State 1. And then state 2, we've had a Jedi deployment and an attack. So it's really only in the state 2 case that we'll have an attack to print for movie watcher output. But how do we get there? Well, the way we get there is through transitions, and each transition represents a deployment landing on the planet. From state 0, if a Sith deployment arrives, nothing happens, because a Sith deployment does not take us to state 1. A Sith deployment cannot land on a planet without a Jedi deployment, so that's state 0, and cause an attack to transition to state 2. And it also can't cause that planet to suddenly have a Jedi deployment. So the Sith deployment landing on the planet at state 0 must transition the planet to state 0. Oh wait, that's not what I meant to do. This was meant to be an S. Okay. So nothing happens here. You don't need to worry about that Sith deployment ever again. You don't need to remember it, because it's never going to be involved in any attack on this planet. And it's not going to have any effect on any attack ever on this planet. But what about a Jedi deployment? Well, when a Jedi deployment arrives on this planet in state 0, it transitions the planet to state 1. So it's primed for an attack. There's not yet been an attack, that's why we're not in state 2, but there is a Jedi deployment, so that's why we're not in state 0. So we're in this intermediate state 1. And how do we get out of state 1? Well, we get out of state 1 by an attack. That's when a Sith deployment arrives, and I'll call this S sub A. A Sith deployment arrives and attacks an existing Jedi deployment. Now this has a condition. The Sith deployment must be, I don't remember if it's strictly stronger or not weaker than the weakest Jedi deployment on the planet so far. But what if a Sith deployment arrives in state 1 and it doesn't want to mount an attack, right? It knows it'll lose. Well then, we have a transition back to state 1. I'll just label this S, because we can just forget about that Sith deployment. It's never going to be involved in any attack on this planet, ever. Okay. Now what if a Jedi deployment arrives on the planet in state 1? It's not going to cause an attack, so the planet stays in state 1. J. And that's all our transitions out of state 1, right? So if a Jedi deployment arrives, we stay in state 1. If a Sith deployment arrives and doesn't attack, we stay in state 1. If a Sith deployment arrives and attacks, we transition to state 2. Now, we have the same 3 options once we're in state 2. Jedi deployment arrives, so we've still had an attack. Sith deployment arrives and doesn't mount an attack, well, we've still had an attack on this planet. So we stay in state 2. Sith deployment arrives and does mount an attack, we stay in state 2 because we have some attack. Now, the distinction between S and SA is whether or not an attack happens. So the condition for SA, there exists a Jedi deployment on the planet, and well, not and. There exists a Jedi deployment that's weaker than arriving Sith deployment. And so there are two ways we could not have an attack, right? So up in this case, so here, there's no Jedi deployment, so this condition is not satisfied. And here, there is a Jedi deployment on the planet, but it's not. There's no Jedi deployment that's weaker than the arriving Sith deployment. So this is not satisfied. So that's why we don't have SA, we just have S. So in just the S transitions, nothing happens. It's a very easy case to handle in your code, because notice they all transition to the same state. You don't need to remember anything because no attack happened and no weaker Jedi deployment arrived that sets up a more exciting attack later on. Now, what happens when a Jedi deployment arrives? Well, we have all our state transitions, but that's not a J. Something else happens. I'm also going to draw a line here because above is the condition for S sub A and below is the description of what happens. When a Jedi deployment arrives, we need to remember the weakest Jedi deployment. So I'm actually going to call this one J star, or not J star, J prime. So J prime, remember this deployment as the weakest Jedi deployment. Because notice for the attack condition, we only need to know about the existence of some Jedi deployment that's weaker than the arriving Sith deployment. Well, if the weakest Jedi deployment is weaker than the arriving Sith deployment, then yes, there is some Jedi deployment that satisfies this condition. And if the weakest Jedi deployment is not weaker than the arriving Sith deployment, then this condition is not satisfied. So you don't need to know anything except the weakest Jedi deployment already on the planet. So when the first Jedi deployment arrives, that's J prime here, it is the weakest Jedi deployment that has arrived on the planet. Now, what about the rest? If weaker than the weakest, we remember the new Jedi deployment as the weakest. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. I'm also going to call this SA prime. And our other two transitions are SA and SA prime. Now what happens in SA prime? Well, in movie watcher mode, we need to remember the most exciting attack on this planet. Well, the first time an attack happens, that's this SA prime transition, that attack is the most exciting attack. So remember this, or remember, yeah, let's call it this attack as the most exciting. And this attack involves the newly arrived Sith deployment. So new Sith deployment. And the weakest Jedi deployment. And remember, we've remembered the weakest Jedi deployment already. And now SA not prime is very similar. But the only difference is we already have a most exciting attack. So we need to compare. If this attack more exciting, remember it as the most exciting. And really, that's all there is to it, right? You run the state machine every time a deployment arrives. You perform the transition corresponding to that state, and that'll depend on really only two things, or three things: the current state, the type of the deployment, Jedi or Sith, and then in certain cases, whether or not there is a weaker Jedi deployment already on the planet, or that has already arrived on the planet. It might not be there anymore, but that doesn't matter for movie watchers. You just run this until the end, and when the time comes to print your movie watcher output, each planet has remembered its weakest Jedi deployment, which doesn't matter anymore, but it has also remembered its most exciting attack, if it's in state 2. Now, if it's not in state 2, there hasn't been an attack, so I believe you print -1 for all your timestamps or whatever. I don't remember exactly what goes into movie watcher output. But if you are in state 2, you have your most exciting attacks. And then symmetrically, the same thing applies to ambushes, just with Jedi and Sith more or less swapped. So that's all. I hope this was able to help you along in the project.